January 1942, Central Luzon, Philippines. Morning heat presses low over the sugarcane fields. The ground vibrates before the sound arrives. Metal tracks grind earth into dust. American infantrymen lie flat in shallow foxholes, rifles clutched tight, eyes fixed on the horizon. Ahead of them, Japanese Type 95 tanks emerge through palm smoke, moving slowly, deliberately. Bullets spark uselessly against sloped steel. Machine gun fire rattles across armor and disappears. There is no answer, no weapon designed to stop what is coming. The men fire anyway, because that is all they have. Across the world, in North Africa and the Pacific, this scene repeats itself with terrifying consistency. Infantry without tanks. Infantry without artillery close enough. Infantry without a portable weapon capable of killing armor. German panzer divisions roll through Soviet and Allied lines. Japanese armor advances against lightly equipped defenders. By 1942, the United States is fully at war. But soldiers are not fully armed. In Washington, reports arrive faster than solutions. In the field, time runs out faster than ammunition. Somewhere between panic and necessity, a question becomes unavoidable. How does a rifleman stop a tank with what he can carry on his back? The answer will not come from the battlefield. It will come from a factory floor in Connecticut. The world learns to fear tanks. By the time the United States entered World War II, the tank was no longer an experiment. It was a verdict. Germany had proven that verdict in Poland in September 1939. Armored columns punched through defensive lines with a speed that stunned observers. Infantry did not hold tanks at bay. Tanks dissolved infantry positions, crushed command structures, and erased the distinction between front and rear. The term blitzkrieg was not doctrine, it was consequence. In France, May 1940, the lesson became irreversible. German panzer divisions crossed the Ardennes, terrain long considered impassable to armor, and emerged behind Allied lines. French and British units, equipped with artillery but lacking portable anti-tank weapons, found themselves outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. Tanks did not wait for infantry support. They were the spear. Across Eastern Europe, the Red Army absorbed the same lesson at catastrophic cost. In 1941, during Operation Barbarossa, German armor advanced hundreds of miles in weeks. Soviet infantry divisions were encircled, fragmented, and annihilated. Anti-tank guns existed, but they were heavy, slow, and required crews and preparation. A tank did not wait for a gun to be emplaced. The battlefield had changed. Infantry could no longer survive on rifles alone. The United States watched all of this from a distance, initially neutral, officially detached, but privately alarmed. American military observers embedded in Europe sent reports home describing the same problem again and again. Tanks were dominating the battlefield. Infantry needed something small, portable, and immediate, something that could be carried by a single soldier and fired under fire. But American doctrine lagged behind reality. Before 1941, U.S. planners still believed anti-tank defense belonged primarily to artillery units. The assumption was simple. Tanks would be engaged at range, destroyed by guns positioned in depth. Infantry, meanwhile, would maneuver and hold ground. It was a doctrine built for order, not chaos. War did not offer order. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and when Japan expanded across the Pacific, speed replaced preparation. Engagements happened suddenly. Terrain collapsed distances. Jungle, desert, and urban environments compressed combat into moments. Tanks appeared where guns were not. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor shattered American neutrality in a single morning. Within days, U.S. forces were engaged across the Pacific. Within weeks, American soldiers faced enemy armor in places where no American tank units existed to counter them. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces fought delaying actions against Japanese troops equipped with light but effective tanks. American infantry used grenades, satchel charges, and courage, but courage could not penetrate steel. Soldiers were forced to wait until tanks came dangerously close before attempting desperate attacks. In North Africa, U.S. planners studied German armor with growing urgency. Reports from British forces fighting Rommel painted a clear picture. Even experienced troops struggled to stop armored thrusts without specialized weapons. The United States was mobilizing at an unprecedented scale. Factories were retooling. Divisions were forming. But one critical question remained unanswered. What could a single American infantryman do when a tank appeared in front of him? The absence of an answer would soon become impossible to ignore, especially as the war expanded and American forces prepared for direct confrontation with the world's most experienced armored armies. That realization would force a reckoning inside the U.S. Army, one that could not be postponed much longer. An industrial problem becomes a battlefield emergency. By early 1942, the United States was producing ships, aircraft, and tanks at a pace unmatched in its history. Assembly lines ran day and night. Steel flowed. Blueprints multiplied. But production volume did not solve every problem. Some gaps were conceptual, not industrial. Anti-tank defense was one of them. The U.S. Army possessed anti-tank guns, 37mm pieces intended to engage light armor. On paper, they appeared adequate. In practice, they were underpowered, difficult to conceal, and increasingly obsolete. Against modern German tanks, even well-placed hits often failed to achieve decisive results. Worse still, these guns required crews, transport, and time to deploy. None of those were guaranteed under fire. Infantry units remained exposed. The Ordnance Department knew it. So did field commanders. After-action reports arriving from British and Soviet fronts told the same story with numbing consistency. Anti-tank guns were too slow. Artillery was too far. Tanks arrived too fast. What the Army needed was a weapon that violated tradition. A weapon that ignored conventional lines between infantry and artillery. A weapon light enough to be carried by one man, powerful enough to defeat armor, and simple enough to be used under extreme stress. The idea itself was not new. Rocket-propelled munitions had existed since the 19th century. During World War I, experimental recoilless rifles and rocket weapons had been tested with limited success. But none had been refined into a reliable infantry tool. In 1941, that changed. American researchers at Aberdeen Proving Ground and the National Defense Research Committee began revisiting an old concept, shaped charges. Unlike kinetic projectiles, shaped charges focused explosive energy into a narrow jet capable of penetrating armor. The principle had been demonstrated scientifically, but not yet weaponized at scale. The challenge was delivery. Conventional guns required recoil management. Rockets did not. If a shaped charge could be delivered by a rocket, the launcher itself could be light. Simple, almost crude. By mid-1941, experimental teams led by figures such as Dr. Clarence Hickman began working on a prototype, a tube-shaped launcher firing a rocket carrying a shaped charge warhead. It was an unorthodox idea, part science experiment, part desperation. The Army moved faster than its bureaucracy preferred. Once the concept proved viable in tests, the next problem emerged immediately. Who would build it? The weapon required precision machining, mass production capability, and experience with small arms. It also needed to be produced quickly, in large numbers, without disrupting other critical programs. The answer pointed toward a familiar name. Winchester Repeating Arms Company had spent decades manufacturing rifles for American soldiers. Its factories in Connecticut were already part of the wartime mobilization. Winchester understood metallurgy. It understood tolerances. And it understood urgency. By 1942, Winchester was tasked with taking an experimental weapon barely tested, barely named, and turning it into something soldiers could trust with their lives. There was no time for perfection, only time for function. Engineers worked under compressed schedules. Prototypes were assembled, tested, redesigned, and assembled again. Failures were documented and corrected in days, not months. Safety concerns were real. Early models could malfunction catastrophically, but delay was no longer acceptable. The weapon received its unofficial name from its appearance. A long tube mounted on a simple grip, it resembled a musical instrument. Soldiers called it the bazooka. What mattered was not the name, but the promise. For the first time, American infantry might be able to meet armor on equal terms, not with hope, but with firepower. That promise, however, still had to survive the only test that mattered: combat. And when it did, the experience of war would reshape both the weapon and the men who carried it. The soldier, the weapon, and the problem of steel. For the American infantrymen in 1942, tanks were not abstract machines. They were immediate, personal threats. They arrived with sound before sight. Engines growling, tracks chewing earth. And once visible, they dominated everything in front of them. Without a dedicated anti-tank weapon, soldiers were forced into dangerous improvisation. Manuals suggested disabling tracks with explosives or attacking from the rear. In reality, this meant allowing a tank to close the distance. It meant crawling towards steel under machine gun fire. It meant hoping the crew inside was distracted long enough to survive the attempt. Fear was not weakness. It was awareness. Veterans described the helplessness of firing rifles at armor they knew could not be stopped. Even grenades required proximity that bordered on suicide. Against trained crews, improvisation rarely succeeded. The bazooka changed the psychology before it changed the battlefield. For the first time, a single soldier could engage armor at distance. He could aim. He could fire. He could retreat. The knowledge that such an option existed altered how infantry perceived approaching tanks. Fear did not vanish, but it was no longer paralyzing. The bazooka was not elegant engineering. It was deliberate simplicity. A smooth steel tube, an electrical firing circuit, a fin-stabilized rocket carrying a shape-charge warhead. There was no recoil to manage, no heavy breech, no complex sighting system. Every design choice prioritized speed of production and ease of use. This simplicity was strategic. Winchester engineers understood that the weapon would be used by soldiers with minimal training, often under extreme conditions. Mud, sand, humidity, and cold could not be allowed to disable it. If a component could be removed, it often was. Yet simplicity carried risks. Early models were prone to misfires. Electrical contacts failed in damp environments. Backblast posed dangers to the operator if procedures were ignored. The bazooka demanded discipline as much as courage. Still, it worked. The introduction of the bazooka forced immediate changes in battlefield tactics. Infantry squads could now be assigned anti-armor responsibility organically. Tanks could no longer assume immunity from foot soldiers. Commanders began positioning bazooka teams along likely armored approaches. Ambush replaced desperation. Terrain became an ally. Narrow roads, urban corners, jungle paths. Tanks remained dangerous, but they were no longer untouchable. These shifts were not theoretical. They were learned in combat, often at high cost. Each engagement refined understanding. Each fired rocket rewrote assumptions. And as soldiers adapted, so did the enemy. German and Japanese forces took note. Armor tactics began to change. Infantry support tightened. Tanks adjusted their movement patterns. A technological answer had created a tactical reaction, and that reaction would shape the next phase of the war, one defined by adaptation on both sides of the battlefield. Command decisions, enemy eyes, and moral weight. For American commanders, the bazooka posed an uncomfortable question. It worked, but not always. It was dangerous to use improperly. Its effective range was limited. Its penetration depended on angle and distance. Yet there was nothing better available in 1942. Leadership meant acceptance. The U.S. Army had to field a weapon that was still evolving, because waiting for refinement meant sending soldiers into battle without any portable anti-tank defense at all. Training programs were accelerated. Manuals were rewritten mid-war. Officers were instructed to integrate bazooka teams despite incomplete data. This decision reflected a broader shift in American wartime leadership. The war demanded speed over certainty. Feedback from the field flowed directly back to engineers. Reports of failures were not buried. They were studied. The bazooka became a living system, shaped by those who depended on it. German forces encountered the bazooka in North Africa and later in Sicily. At first, it was dismissed as a novelty. Early models struggled against frontal armor of heavier tanks. But when used correctly, at close range, against side or rear armor, it was deadly. What mattered most was not how many tanks were destroyed, but how many had to slow down. German after-action reports noted increased caution. Tank crews adjusted routes. Infantry escorts became mandatory. Armor could no longer advance blindly into urban or wooded terrain. Japanese armor faced a similar reckoning in the Pacific. Though lighter, Japanese tanks had relied on speed and infantry coordination. The bazooka disrupted that balance. Even when penetration was incomplete, damage to tracks or engine compartments neutralized vehicles. Armor, once dominant, became conditional. The bazooka placed enormous responsibility on individual soldiers. One man's judgment, when to fire, where to aim, whether to risk exposure, could determine survival for an entire unit. This concentration of power carried weight. Operators described the moment of firing as intensely personal. There was no barrage to hide behind, no distance to dilute consequence. The shot was deliberate, the result immediate. In this way, the bazooka humanized anti-tank warfare. It was no longer abstract firepower delivered from afar. It was a soldier standing his ground against a machine designed to overrun him. That moment, man versus armor, would define the bazooka's place in history. And it would soon be tested at scale, under fire, in battles where hesitation meant destruction and success meant survival. Those battles would form the crucible in which the weapon proved its worth. First shots that changed the balance. The bazooka entered combat quietly. There was no ceremony, no announcement, no confidence that it would work as intended. In early 1942, small numbers of launchers reached American units in North Africa. They arrived as unfamiliar tools, light, awkward, and untested under real fire. Operators trained quickly, sometimes only hours before engagement. The terrain of North Africa was unforgiving. Open ground exposed infantry long before tanks came into effective range. German armor, hardened by years of combat, moved with discipline and coordination. Panzer crews understood their advantage and expected it to hold. The first engagements were cautious. Bazooka teams waited. They watched armor approach. They measured distance not in meters, but in seconds. When the first rocket was fired, it was an experiment under fire. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, American forces faced a brutal test. Though the bazooka was still in early distribution, reports from the battle highlighted its emerging role. Tanks advancing through constrained terrain became vulnerable when infantry could engage from concealment. Penetration was not always complete. Some rockets deflected, some detonated imperfectly. But when hits landed true, the effect was immediate. Armor plates failed. Tracks shattered. Crews abandoned vehicles under fire. Just as important, tanks slowed. For the first time, American infantry could shape armored movement. They could deny roads, protect flanks, and force enemy units to deploy cautiously. The psychological shift was profound. Confidence grew, not in invincibility, but in possibility. Engineers thousands of miles away studied every report. They noted failures and successes alike. Improvements followed rapidly. Electrical firing systems were refined. Rocket motors adjusted. Warhead design improved. The bazooka evolved in weeks, what peacetime development might have taken years to accomplish. Elsewhere, in the Pacific, the weapon found a different battlefield. Jungle terrain compressed distances. Japanese tanks appeared suddenly along narrow paths. Here, the bazooka's short range became an advantage rather than a limitation. Infantry ambushes replaced desperate assaults. A single rocket could halt an advance. Japanese armor, lightly protected, proved vulnerable when caught in confined terrain. Still, the weapon demanded nerve. Bazooka operators had to expose themselves. They had to wait until armor entered effective range. They had to trust their equipment under fire. Each engagement refined doctrine. Each surviving operator taught the next. And as experience accumulated, the bazooka moved from experiment to expectation, an accepted part of the infantry arsenal. But its decisive impact had not yet been fully realized. That moment would come when American forces met German armor in sustained combat, under conditions where failure could not be absorbed. Those conditions were approaching. When infantry stood their ground, by mid-1943, the bazooka was no longer rare. It was standard issue. American units landing in Sicily carried it ashore alongside rifles and machine guns. Training had improved. Doctrine had adjusted. Infantry squads now planned for armor contact as a certainty, not a surprise. German commanders understood this shift immediately. In the narrow roads and stone villages of Sicily, tanks could not maneuver freely. Infantry support was essential. Yet even with coordination, the presence of bazooka teams changed every engagement. Armor could no longer lead assaults without risk. Each corner, each rubble-strewn street, became a potential ambush. Combat reports from Sicily noted increased tank losses to close-range infantry weapons. The bazooka did not replace artillery or air power, but it closed a lethal gap. It gave infantry agency in moments where none had existed before. In Italy, the pattern repeated. Mountain terrain forced tanks into predictable routes. American bazooka teams positioned themselves above roads, firing downward into vulnerable armor. Even when penetration failed, damage slowed or disabled vehicles, forcing German units to adapt under pressure. The bazooka's role expanded beyond tank killing. It became a tool for bunker destruction, strong point reduction, and urban combat. Its explosive power, once reserved for armored targets, found new utility in complex terrain. German intelligence took note. Countermeasures appeared. Additional armor plating was added to some vehicles. Tactics shifted toward combined arms. But adaptation took time, and time was exactly what American forces gained. In Normandy, 1944, the bazooka faced its most demanding test. German tanks were heavier. Armor was thicker. Engagements were chaotic. Results were mixed, but meaningful. Bazooka teams targeted tracks, rear armor, and side plates. In hedgerow country, where sightlines were short, infantry could close distance unseen. Tanks that survived direct hits were often immobilized, becoming targets for artillery or air attack. The bazooka was no longer expected to win alone. It was expected to contribute, and it did. By this stage of the war, American soldiers trusted the weapon, not because it was perfect, but because it gave them a chance. That trust mattered. It altered how infantry fought. It altered how armor advanced. And it altered the rhythm of ground combat itself. The turning point was not a single battle. It was a realization, repeated across fronts, that tanks could be stopped by the men they once overran. With that realization came consequences that extended beyond the battlefield. Those consequences would define the weapon's legacy. Measuring impact in steel and survival. By late 1944, the bazooka was woven into the fabric of American infantry warfare. Its presence no longer drew attention. Its absence, however, was unthinkable. Quantifying its impact required more than counting destroyed tanks. Official reports recorded confirmed kills, but commanders understood that immobilization mattered just as much as destruction. A tank with a shattered track was no longer a weapon. It was an obstacle. Field assessments from Europe and the Pacific consistently noted reduced armor penetration into infantry positions. Tanks advanced more cautiously. Routes were reconnoitered. Infantry support became heavier. All of this slowed enemy operations and reduced casualties among foot soldiers. Production reflected this success. Winchester and other manufacturers scaled output rapidly. Variants improved reliability and penetration. Training programs standardized instruction. The bazooka evolved from emergency solution to established system. The psychological effect remained its most significant contribution. Infantry units reported increased confidence when facing armored threats. This did not lead to recklessness, but to preparedness. Soldiers planned, coordinated, and held positions they might otherwise have abandoned. The bazooka also influenced Allied forces. British and Soviet designers studied captured examples. Germany responded with its own rocket launchers, including the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck, acknowledgments that infantry anti-tank weapons were now essential, not optional. In this way, the bazooka reshaped the battlefield beyond American lines. It was not a war-winning weapon by itself. Tanks continued to dominate when supported properly. Heavy armor remained resilient. The bazooka's effectiveness depended on training, terrain, and opportunity. Its true success lay in balance. Infantry no longer faced armor as prey. They faced it as participants in a contest where skill and planning mattered. That shift had consequences for strategy, doctrine, and design. Consequences that would unfold even after the war ended. Those longer-term effects would reveal the bazooka's place not just in World War II, but in the evolution of warfare itself. Legacy written in doctrine and design. As the war drew toward its conclusion, the bazooka's influence extended far beyond the battlefield reports that had justified its creation. What began as an emergency response to a lethal gap became a permanent change in how armies thought about infantry power. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Army emphasized a clear conclusion. Infantry units required organic anti-armor capability. This principle was no longer debated. It was assumed. Future force structures would build around it. Technological evolution followed naturally. Improved rocket launchers appeared within years. Warheads became more powerful. Guidance and propulsion systems advanced. The core idea, a man-portable launcher firing a shape-charged projectile, remained unchanged. The bazooka had established the template. Its influence crossed borders. Captured examples and battlefield experience informed Soviet, British, and German post-war designs. The proliferation of infantry anti-tank weapons in the Cold War traced its lineage directly to the lessons learned between 1942 and 1945. But the legacy was not purely technical. The bazooka symbolized a shift in wartime problem-solving. It demonstrated that industrial speed, scientific theory, and battlefield feedback could be fused under extreme pressure. Winchester's role illustrated how civilian manufacturing could adapt to urgent military needs without abandoning precision or reliability. For the soldiers who carried it, the memory was more personal. Veterans rarely spoke of the weapon with romanticism. They spoke of it as a tool, dangerous, imperfect, and necessary. It was heavy when carried for miles, loud when fired, unforgiving when mishandled. But when armor appeared, it mattered. The bazooka gave infantrymen something rare in modern war: agency in the face of overwhelming force. It did not promise victory, It promised a chance. That promise endured long after the last rocket was fired in anger. And it leads to a broader question, one that extends beyond steel and explosives, beyond factories and battlefields. What does it mean when necessity forces innovation, and innovation reshapes how humans confront power? That question lingers, even as the war recedes into history. When necessity becomes invention. The bazooka was not born from ambition. It was born from absence. In 1942, American soldiers faced a modern battlefield with incomplete tools. Tanks had outpaced doctrine. Steel had outrun tradition. The bazooka emerged not as a symbol of dominance, but as a correction, an acknowledgement that war had changed faster than planners expected. Its story is not one of technological triumph alone. It is a story of urgency, of engineers working against time, of factories translating theory into survival, of soldiers trusting an unfamiliar weapon because the alternative was worse. The bazooka did not end the age of the tank. It rebalanced it. By placing real power in the hands of individual infantrymen, it restored a measure of equilibrium to the battlefield. Armor could still advance, but could no longer assume immunity. Every movement carried risk. Every engagement demanded coordination. That lesson outlived the war. Modern infantry anti-tank weapons trace their lineage to this moment, when necessity stripped away complexity and forced simplicity to carry the weight of survival. The shaped charge, the rocket launcher, the idea that one soldier could challenge a machine designed to overrun him. These became permanent features of warfare. History often remembers victories and defeats. Less often does it remember the gaps in between, the moments when something was missing and someone had to invent their way out. In 1942, America had no answer to tanks at the infantry level, so it built one. And in doing so, it changed how wars would be fought, one soldier, one shot, and one decision at a time.